He inherited an ancient mine, only to see an alien beauty chained below. The deed to the V982 sector felt like a heavy, useless weight in the pocket of Beckett's flight jacket. He stepped off the transport onto the jagged surface of the asteroid, his boots crunching against silicate grit that had seen better days during the height of the expansion wars. The air scrubbers hummed with a rhythmic, dying rattle that vibrated through the soles of his feet. He was a tall man, built with the broad shoulders of a deep space mechanic and the weary eyes of someone who had spent too many years looking for a reason to stop moving. The mining facility rose like a rusted skeletal hand from the gray rock, its gantries groaning under the gravitational stresses of the nearby gas giant. He wasn't here for the prestige. He was here because his uncle had left him a hole in the ground and a mountain of unpaid taxes. He adjusted the seal on his collar, feeling the warmth of his own breath trapped against his skin. The silence of the void was absolute, broken only by the internal thrum of his own heartbeat. "You the new owner?" a voice rasped over the comms. Beckett turned to see a squat, four-armed figure standing near the airlock. It was Silas, the foreman who had stayed behind when the rest of the crew deserted the failing operation. The alien's skin was the color of bruised plums, covered in a fine layer of industrial grease. "I am," Beckett replied. He followed Silas into the pressurized tunnel, the sudden change in atmosphere making his ears pop. The interior was dimly lit by flickering amber strips, revealing walls stained with the soot of 1,000 heavy-duty drills. "There is a section in the lower depths that was not in the original survey," Silas muttered, his secondary arms twitching with a nervous energy that Beckett didn't like. They descended past the primary ore veins, going deeper than the automated maps suggested the mine should go. The temperature began to drop, the air turning metallic and cold. The elevator car jerked to a halt at level 60, a floor that didn't exist on the digital schematics. Silas refused to step out, pointing toward a heavy bulkhead door that looked as if it had been forged from a single piece of dark, nameless alloy. Beckett gripped the handle of his heavy-duty plasma cutter, the weight of the tool comforting in his calloused palm. He pushed the door open and the smell hit him, not the sulfur of the mines, but something floral and sweet, like crushed orchids after a rainstorm. The room was a massive dome, filled with humming machinery that pulsed with a soft, bioluminescent blue light. In the center of the chamber, suspended by thick, translucent cables that pierced the ceiling, was a woman. Her skin was a vibrant, shimmering violet, and her hair flowed around her like liquid silver in the low gravity. She was Vesper, and she was naked save for the glowing metal rings that encircled her wrists and ankles, pinning her to a central pillar. "What is this?" Beckett whispered. He felt a sudden sharp heat rise in his chest, a protective urge that flared hotter than the engines of his ship. Vesper lifted her head, her eyes a deep, swirling gold that seemed to hold the light of a dying nebula. She looked at him not with fear, but with a weary, desperate hope that made his throat tighten. "I am the core," she said, her voice a melodic vibration that echoed directly in his mind. Beckett didn't hesitate, stepping onto the raised platform. He could see the way the cables were drawing a faint, glowing vapor from her skin, feeding it into the massive capacitors that lined the walls. Her body was a masterpiece of alien biology, lithe and curved, every muscle defined by the tension of her bonds. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her shoulder. The air around her was cold, as if she were a heat sink for the entire facility. "I'm getting you out of here," he said. "The resonance will kill a mortal," Vesper warned. Her breath hitched as Beckett ignored her, his fingers finally making contact with her skin. The shock was immediate. It wasn't electricity, but a profound, draining cold that tried to leach the very life from his marrow. Most species would have folded, their hearts stopping under the thermal drain, but Beckett was human. His metabolism roared to life, his core temperature spiked, and he leaned into the sensation. He felt his own blood thundering in his ears, a stubborn, burning defiance against the machine's hunger. He gripped the metal ring at her wrist, his knuckles turning white as he strained against the lock. The machinery groaned, the blue light turning a violent, angry red as it sensed a foreign, high-energy presence. He felt Vesper's eyes on him, wide and disbelieving, as his skin flushed with a deep, healthy red. He was an engine of heat in a room designed for the dead. "You are burning," she gasped. Beckett gritted his teeth, his muscles bunching as he applied the full force of his leverage. "That's just being human, sweetheart," he grunted. With a sound like a gunshot, the first shackle shattered. The feedback loop broke, sending a shower of sparks across the platform. Vesper slumped forward and Beckett caught her, his arms wrapping around her cool, silky waist. The contrast was staggering. His skin was a furnace, hers a frozen lake. She let out a soft moan as her body began to absorb his warmth, her fingers digging into his biceps. The machinery in the room began to wind down, the hum dropping into a low, mournful dirge. Behind them, the bulkhead door hissed open. Silas stood there, but he wasn't alone. Two heavy-set guards with pulse rifles stood at his side, their faces masked by tactical respirators. "That property is worth more than this entire system," Silas shouted. "She isn't property," Beckett said. He didn't let her go, instead shifting her weight so she was shielded by his body. He felt the rapid flutter of her heart against his chest, a quick avian rhythm that was slowly stabilizing. "The mine is a weapon, human," Silas sneered, stepping into the room. "She is the ignition sequence for the Sun Eater. You have no idea what you have just awakened," the alien continued. Beckett looked down at Vesper. The revelation hit him with the weight of a physical blow. She wasn't just a prisoner. She was a biological component of a weapon capable of extinguishing stars. The ancient mine wasn't for ore, it was a silo. He looked back at the guards, his eyes narrowing. Humans were known for many things in the galaxy: their endurance, their unpredictability, and their absolute refusal to let go of what they considered theirs. "Then I guess I'm taking the ignition with me," he said. He moved with a speed that caught the guards off guard, his human reflexes honed by years of zero-gravity combat drills. He kicked a heavy metal crate toward the nearest guard and lunged for his plasma cutter. The beam of ionized gas sliced through the air, melting the barrels of the rifles before the guards could squeeze a shot. He didn't stop there. He grabbed a heavy wrench from his belt and swung it with the brute force of a man who worked with steel for a living. The guards went down hard, their carapaces cracking under the impact. He scooped Vesper up in his arms, her head tucked into the hollow of his neck. She was shivering now, her body desperately trying to regulate its temperature as it disconnected from the ship's systems. "Hold on," he commanded. He ran for the elevator, his lungs burning as he pushed his body to its physical limit. The facility was beginning to shake, the structural integrity failing as the Sun Eater's power source was removed. They reached his ship, a battered but reliable freighter named the Dodge, just as the docking bay began to depressurize. He slammed the hatch shut and carried Vesper into the living quarters, laying her on the bunk. The room was small, smelling of recycled air and machine oil. He stripped off his jacket and wrapped it around her, but she was still shaking violently. "My blood is cold," she whispered. "I need the light," she added. Beckett knew she didn't mean sunlight. She needed the thermal energy his body produced. He climbed onto the bunk beside her, pulling her against him. The touch was electric. As she pressed her violet skin against his chest, he felt a surge of raw, unadulterated desire that nearly took his breath away. She was beautiful in a way that felt dangerous, a celestial being held in the arms of a grease monkey. Her hands wandered over his torso, marveling at the thickness of his muscles and the sheer heat radiating from his pores. "You are like a star," she murmured. She tilted her head back, her gold eyes searching his. Beckett felt the tension in the room shift from survival to something much more intimate. He ran his thumb over her bottom lip, nodding the way it trembled under his touch. "Humans run hot," he said. "We're built to survive places we shouldn't be," he added. She didn't wait for him to say more. She pulled his head down, her lips meeting his in a kiss that tasted like ozone and honey. It was desperate and hungry, a collision of two worlds. He groaned, his hands sliding down to her hips, pulling her flush against his mounting arousal. The ship groaned as it broke orbit, but in the small cabin, the only sound was the heavy rhythm of their breathing. He explored the curves of her body, his calloused hands a stark contrast to her velvet-smooth skin. Every touch elicited a soft, musical sound from her throat, a melody of pleasure that drove him toward the edge of his self-control. Vesper moved with a fluid grace, her limbs wrapping around him as if she were trying to merge their very essences. The bioluminescent patterns on her skin began to glow brighter, pulsing in time with the friction of their bodies. She was absorbing not just his heat, but the very intensity of his passion. Beckett felt a connection he couldn't explain, a biological tether that made him want to claim her, to protect her from every shadow in the dark. He entered her with a slow, deliberate push, a gasp escaping both of them as they became one. It was a physical overload. He felt her internal temperature rise to match his, the coldness finally banished. They moved together in the cramped bunk, the stars outside the viewport blurring into streaks of white as the jump drive engaged. In that moment, the fate of the galaxy and the weapon they had escaped felt like distant, unimportant ghosts. The afterglow was short-lived as the ship's proximity alarms began to wail. Beckett sat up, his chest heaving, his skin slick with a mixture of his sweat and her glowing essence. He pulled on his trousers and headed for the cockpit, Vesper following close behind, wrapped in a spare flight suit that was far too large for her. On the long-range scanners, a fleet of high-speed interceptors was closing in. They bore the markings of the hegemony, the very people who had commissioned the Sun Eater. "They won't let us go," Vesper said. Her voice was steady now, her power restored by their union. "They think we're just another resource to be mined," she continued. Beckett gripped the flight controls, his eyes hardening. "They've never tried to mine a human," he muttered. He flipped a series of switches, bypassing the safety limiters on the engines. He knew the ship couldn't outrun them, but he had spent his life fixing things that were broken. He could turn a freighter into a bomb if he had to. "What are you doing?" Vesper asked. She watched as he began to reroute the power from the life support systems into the forward shields. "I'm going to show them why humans are the most dangerous thing in the void," he said. He didn't use a sophisticated tactical computer. He used his gut. He dived the ship into the upper atmosphere of the gas giant, using the crushing gravity to swing them around like a stone in a sling. The hegemony ships followed, their more delicate sensors struggling to compensate for the atmospheric interference. Beckett felt the G-force pressing him into his seat, his heart hammering against his ribs. He waited until the lead interceptor was right on his tail, then he dumped the ship's cooling baffles. A cloud of superheated plasma erupted from the rear of the Dodge, acting like a localized sun. The interceptor's shields, designed for the cold vacuum, shattered instantly under the unprecedented thermal shock. "That was unconventional," Vesper remarked. She was leaning over his shoulder, her hand resting on the nape of his neck. The physical contact kept him grounded, kept his mind sharp. "It was messy," Beckett corrected. "But it worked," he added. The remaining ships hesitated, their pilots clearly reassessing the threat. They expected a terrified refugee. They found a human mechanic who fought like a cornered beast. Beckett used the opening to punch the coordinates for the outer rim. He knew they would keep coming, but for now they had breathing room. He turned the seat around, pulling Vesper into his lap. She sat with her legs draped over his, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that made him feel more alive than he ever had in the mines. "You destroyed their weapon," she said. "I destroyed a machine," he replied. "I saved you," he added. They spent the next few weeks in the quiet of deep space, the Dodge drifting between the stars. The romance between them deepened, moving past the initial desperation into something more profound. Beckett taught her how to maintain the ship, his hands guiding hers over the complex circuitry. He found himself fascinated by the way her mind worked, the way she saw the universe as a series of interconnected vibrations. In return, he showed her what it meant to be human, the food, the music, and the physical intimacy that never seemed to lose its fire. They spent hours tangled together in the bunk, exploring every inch of each other. He loved the way she would arch her back when he bit the soft curve of her neck, and the way her golden eyes would dim when she reached the peak of her pleasure. She was his anchor, and he was her sun. "I can feel them searching," Vesper said one evening. They were sitting on the floor of the cargo bay, looking out at a distant nebula. "The hegemony won't stop until they have the core," she added. Beckett sharpened a vibro blade, the rhythmic scraping the only sound in the room. "Let them search," he said. "We're not going back to that hole in the ground," he continued. He looked at her, his expression softening. "I inherited a mine, but I ended up with a kingdom," he said. She smiled, a rare, brilliant expression that lit up the room. "And what will we do with our kingdom, Beckett?" she asked. He stood up, offering her his hand. "Whatever we want," he replied. "But first, I think I need to remind you how much I like your skin against mine," he added. The final confrontation happened near a black hole at the edge of the galaxy. The hegemony had sent their flagship, a massive dreadnought commanded by an admiral who didn't understand the concept of no. Beckett didn't try to outgun them. Instead, He used the mining equipment he had salvaged from V982. He had spent his downtime modifying the heavy-duty drills into magnetic harpoons. As the dreadnought moved into firing range, Beckett launched the harpoons, anchoring the Dodge to the enemy's hull. He then reversed the polarity of the ship's engines, creating a localized gravity well. The dreadnought, caught in the unexpected drag, began to tilt toward the black hole's event horizon. It was a move of sheer madness, the kind of gamble only a human would take. "We are going to be pulled in," Vesper cried. She was strapped into the co-pilot's seat, her hands white-knuckled on the armrests. "Trust me," Beckett shouted over the roar of the straining engines. He waited until the last possible second, until the dreadnought was irrevocably caught in the black hole's maw, then he detonated the harpoons. The explosive force pushed the Dodge backward, the recoil acting like a secondary thruster. They skipped off the edge of the gravity well, the ship groaning and shedding hull plates as it escaped. The dreadnought was not so lucky, vanishing into the singularity with a silent, distorted scream of metal. Beckett slumped back in his seat, his heart pounding a frantic, triumphant rhythm. He was covered in sweat, his hands shaking from the adrenaline, but he was laughing. Vesper unbuckled her seatbelt and threw herself at him, her lips finding his in a bruising, celebratory kiss. She climbed onto his lap, her hands tearing at his shirt. "You are a monster," she whispered against his skin. "A wonderful, terrifying monster," she added. Beckett gripped her hair, pulling her head back so he could see her eyes. "I'm just a guy who wanted to keep his girl," he said. The ship was a wreck, the systems were failing, and they were light years from the nearest station. But as he looked at her, Beckett knew they were going to be fine. He picked her up and carried her toward the back of the ship. They didn't need a functioning engine to be happy. They had each other, and they had a whole universe to get lost in. The asteroid mine was a memory, a dark place that had given birth to something beautiful. As they drifted through the silent, star-dusted reaches of the outer rim, Beckett and Vesper built a new life. They became legends in the fringe systems, the human who stole a star and the woman who loved him for it. They weren't heroes, and they weren't villains. They were just two souls who had found heat in the cold of the void. Every time Beckett touched her, he was reminded of the day he broke her chains. And every time Vesper looked at him, she saw the fire that could never be extinguished. They were the ultimate proof of humanity's greatest strength, the ability to turn a dead-end inheritance into a future that was truly, wonderfully alive.